On 3:30 in the afternoon of 17 September 2024, around 5,000 pagers all across Lebanon began to alert and then seconds later exploded in the hands or on the belts of their recipients. It turns out that all the pagers were owned by Hezbollah terrorists and the Lebanese Shia Islamist political party, and that the entire event was orchestrated by the Israeli intelligence service, Mossad, in what will undoubtedly be considered one of the most brilliant counter-terrorist operations in all of history. And the next day, they topped it off by detonating about 500 ICOM walkie-talkie radios used by Hezbollah. This epic operation is reminiscent of another ingenious operation conducted by the Americans during the Vietnam War. That operation was called Project Eldest Son and was the brainchild of Colonel Jack Singlob, who in 1968 was commander of a highly classified military organization called SOG. Those initials stood for Studies and Observation Group and later Special Operations Group. This organization included select soldiers, sailors, and airmen from Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, and Air Force Air Commandos. Their mission was to conduct combat reconnaissance operations behind the lines in North and South Vietnam against the Viet Cong and the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and they reported directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. During these small unit reconnaissance missions, teams would often find large caches of enemy weapons and tons of enemy supplies, including ammunition. Some of the supplies, such as rice, could be easily destroyed by fire, but the ammunition was a different matter, as it was difficult to catch on fire, and if you blew it up, you would just scatter the rounds everywhere, but not destroy them. Crazily enough, it was a letter to the editor of the American Rifleman magazine that provided the answer. Why not booby-trap the ammo itself? And that is exactly what they did. Colonel Singlob asked the CIA ordnance experts at Camp Chenin, Okinawa, to do a feasibility study, taking specifically the AK-47 round, the 7.62mm by 39mm Soviet or Chinese round. They pulled the bullet out, discarded the smokeless powder, and replaced it with a powder similar to Petin, high explosive, but shock sensitive enough so a rifle primer would detonate it. Petin stood for penta-erythritol tetranitrate, a high explosive invented in 1894 and first produced in 1912. The Germans used Petin all through the First and Second World Wars. The 7.62mm by 39 round was chosen as it was the most common round used by North Vietnam and was used back then in the AK-47, the modernized AKM, and the Chinese version of those same rifles known as the Type 56. There were also much smaller quantities of other Warsaw Pact countries with their versions of the AK-47, such as the Polish PMK, the Romanian PMMD 6365, and a few Hungarian AMD 65s, and even the North Korean Type 58. The round was also used by the SKS carbine and the Chinese version of that, confusingly also called the Type 56, and the Chinese Type 63 rifle that was basically a select-fire SKS that used an AK-47 bolt and could take the AK magazine. Finally, there was the RPD light machine gun that fired from a non-disintegrating mental link belt held inside a drum magazine. They did a test with a sabotage round chambered in a bench-mounted AK-47 with a long string attached to the trigger. Colonel Singlob himself pulled the trigger, and the resulting explosion completely destroyed the weapon, blasting the receiver to pieces and shooting the bolt backwards. The Joint Chiefs approved the program, and the CIA began the careful process of building these rounds so that they would pass cursory inspection. Also involved in this project was Conrad Ben Baker, the Deputy Director of the Army's Counterinsurgency Support Office, also out of Okinawa. It was Ben that realized that the white-powdered Petin didn't remotely resemble gunpowder, so he found a replacement that was more closely resembled the smokeless powder used in Chinese ammunition. The AK-47 assault rifle and the SKS rifle were designed to withstand a maximum chamber pressure of around 45,000 psi. This new explosive powder generated 5 times that amount, or 250,000 psi, enough to completely shatter the weapon. They also began to produce 12.7mm DSHK rounds for the Russian 50 cal, and then 82mm mortar rounds by replacing the fuse with one that would detonate the warhead before it even left the tube. Sabotaging ammunition like this was not new. The Brits did it back in the late 1930s in northwest India's Waziristan province against rebellious tribesmen, and even before that in the obscure Second Matabele War in southern Rhodesia, or what is now Zimbabwe, back in 1896 and 97. From then on, each SOG recon team would carry a few loose Eldest Son rounds for insertion into a magazine or a belt of ammunition, or a full AK magazine with a single booby-trapped round inside, or sometimes an entire case of ammo with one bad round. These would be left among other similar items they found in enemy supply caches, or the magazine in a dead enemy soldier's rifle would be replaced with an Eldest Son magazine. The recon teams were always careful to never place two Eldest Son rounds in the same magazine, belt, or even ammo can, so that no amount of searching after a weapon was destroyed could reveal a second sabotaged round. The 82mm mortar rounds came in a wooden box of 3, which weighed about 25 or 28 pounds, which meant they were carried much less often. For most SOG recon teams, the Eldest Son rounds were not their primary mission, but were placed as opportunities appeared. One of the most unique Eldest Son ammunition insertions was done by SOG SEALs in the Mekong Delta. They filled a captured sampan with sabotaged cases of ammunition, decorated the boat with bullet holes, spilled some chicken blood all over as if the Viet Cong crew had fallen overboard, and then let it drift down to a known communist village. The VC took the entire boat, hook, line, and sinker. Thank you, Major Plaster. Though the Viet Cong and the NVA were very good at recovering their dead and wounded from the battlefield, U.S. units in Vietnam began finding dead enemy soldiers with pieces of destroyed rifle scattered around them. Since these units were not aware of the Eldest Son project, they assumed it was faulty ammunition or poor weapons manufacturing. In June of 1968, 1st Infantry Division soldiers found a dead NVA soldier, his Type 56 rifle completely shattered. The 1st ID soldiers assumed that since his magazine was partially empty and nothing was blocking the bore, it must have been bad metallurgy or maybe defective ammo. Soldiers from the 25th Infantry Division found an enemy 4-tube mortar battery completely destroyed, with every 82mm mortar tube peeled open like a banana, with dead gun crews all around. This was not the only instance of a destroyed mortar tube and dead and wounded gun crews. 101st Airborne Division Firebase heard a mortar tube firing in the jungle at their position, and then heard a louder explosion. A patrol the next morning found a destroyed tube and blood trails leading off into the jungle. The vast majority of Eldest Son project rounds were infiltrated into North Vietnam, though they started seeing the lethal results in South Vietnam, as the ammunition was obviously transported down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to supply the Viet Cong insurgents there. Now began part 2 of this operation, a brilliant disinformation campaign designed to sow further doubts and distrust in the communist Chinese supplies that were prevalent across the battlefield. The SOG Dirty Tricks Department began to forge NVA documents declaring there was a problem, but not to worry, it was being taken care of. These documents both downplayed the effect of this bad ammo, but admitted that it was a real problem. Then SOG recon teams would place these official memos either in the bodies of dead enemy officers or senior enlisted, or leave them in headquarters bunkers that they had already cleared or destroyed. In order to protect U.S. military personnel and soldiers from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and other allied nations from using captured ammunition and suffering casualties from exploding rounds, SOG produced a Technical Intelligence Brief, number 2-68, Analysis of Damaged Enemy Weapons. This document blamed the deadly weapon failures on both faulty ammunition and poor metallurgy during the weapon manufacturing process. This document recommended that no captured ammunition or weapons ever be used by U.S., Allied or ARVN forces. Despite this warning, there was one reported incident of an American soldier being injured by an Eldest Son round fired from a captured weapon. And just to make sure North Vietnam received this brief, a copy was accidentally left at a Saigon bar known to have communist sympathies. Radio intercepts of NVA communications confirmed that the NVA blamed the People's Republic of China for bad ammunition, as they constantly issued specific warnings and directives to their troops in vain attempts to reduce the lethal incidents from poor quality Chinese weapons and ammo. There were a few recon teams where Eldest Son placement was their primary mission, and one of the worst losses for SOG happened when one of these teams was being inserted on a mission. Major Samuel Toomey led a 7-man team of Green Berets aboard a King B helicopter about 20 miles west of Khe Sanh when they were hit by a single enemy 37mm anti-aircraft round. The King B completely disintegrated as it was carrying a dozen cases of the 82mm mortar rounds. There were no survivors, and it took until 1989, 20 years, for any of the remains to be identified, well after the war was over. As devastating as the loss of Major Toomey's team was, the bad news was not over. The team had gone down over Laos, and the American ambassador in the capital of Vientiane was furious because he had not been briefed on the operation and thus had not approved it. The ambassador's protest was so strong it almost canceled the Eldest Son project. There were a number of other booby-trapped items that were related to the Eldest Son project, and they were designed primarily to make the enemy wary of looting the bodies of SOG recon teams killed in action. These included 35mm cameras that SOG knew would be collected and passed up the chain to NVA intelligence officers, who would open the camera only for it to blow up in their face. There was also the innocuous and ubiquitous 1-quart canteen that even had a liquid sloshing around inside. The first time the cap was unscrewed, it released a safety, so the second time it would blow up in the user's hands. Another device that was booby-trapped to reduce exploitation by the enemy was the AN PRC-25 FM radios that were used not only by SOG, but by regular U.S. Army and the Allied Army of the Republic of Vietnam. These radios were packed with explosives and a detonator that would trigger when the radio was switched on. By the summer of 1969, the cover for Eldest Son was starting to fray, as Time magazine reported that Army Special Forces had been accused of slipping doctored ammunition designed to explode on use into enemy arms caches. Even the Army Times published an article about the defective metallurgy and faulty ammo. The Eldest Son project was re-encrypted as Italian Green, and then, as the enemy began to suspect the real source of their bad ammo, encrypted a third time as Whole Bean. In the late fall of 1969, the Joint Chiefs directed SOG to dispose of the rest of the Eldest Son ammunition and end the program. By November, SOG teams were in a rush to dispose of as much of the tainted ammo as they could before their authority ran out. By now, the enemy pretty much understood that the SOG recon teams were responsible for all the bad ammunition they had endured. Nevertheless, it made them think twice about any ammunition that SOG teams might have discovered and tampered with, and this doubt was the primary mission of Project Eldest Son from the very beginning. How many enemy soldiers were killed by these rounds remains unknown, and covert programs like this have and continue to exist around the world, ranging from non-lethal rounds that will burn at high temperatures and fuse the bolt to the chamber, rendering the weapon permanently non-functional, to explosives that are not necessarily designed to injure the user, but will destroy the weapon, to explosives that will destroy the weapon and permanently maim or kill the user. There are credible reports that the Syrian government is using this type of program against the Syrian rebels. The problem is that no government has ever admitted that they conduct this type of covert program. It would negate the term covert.